This is first Saturday of the month of June, the year of 2024. And we're recording this because I sent out the wrong link. So some people who want to get on can't get on, and we're going to just put this back up on our YouTube channel, and we can all have a good time talking about it. I want you to pay attention because what happened the other day? We were counting the clicks on our total count on the Eden podcast, and we have now passed how many?
200,000.
Yeah, I was going to say $2,000, but that's not right. It's 200 grand. Yeah, 200,000. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for listening and downloading. And we've had people download from 127 countries now so far. And that's great. It's fantastic. So 200,000 downloads on the podcast, more than 40,000 views on YouTube. Good morning, Liana. So we're just really excited about that, and the number of friends that the Lord has been bringing together for this, and more than friends, we're serious soldiers in this battle. And our battle is to true the verse of Genesis 3:16 and the related passages. So what do you mean, true the verse? It means that the translation of Genesis 3:16 is great in Hebrew, but when we've been translating it into our English languages in the last 70 years, they have been adding some other words and taking out some key words. And so it makes it look like God is wonderful and sweet in Genesis chapter 2 and nasty and untrustworthy in Genesis chapter 3. And so what happens is that people begin to doubt God, or it begins to twist their interpretation of New Testament passages, and it's caused all kinds of problems. So Dr. Joy Fleming, in her research, and ever since, she has pointed out that what happened? God said two things in Genesis 3:16. I'm going to multiply your sorrowful toil and field work because of what the man did. I'm going to impose a curse on the ground, and he's going to have that. You're going to have it. Everybody's going to have sorrowful toil and field work. And I am going to confirm that you will have conception of the promised offspring. And we know the name of that offspring, that's Jesus Christ. It took many generations, but that's what God promised to Eve in the Garden of Eden. However, modern translations say you're going to have pain in childbirth, which is a whole different thing and not based on what the text actually says. And it makes it look like God basically cursed the woman and leads to all kinds of complications. So that's what's going on with the Eden podcast, with Tru316.com, with the True School workshops that we do, the Eden book series. We're just trying to get one idea out. And then as you can trust God and you can love God, and that he is delightful and creative and loving and merciful and righteous and just, and that makes us fall in love with the word of God all the more, and makes us sad that people aren't getting that true message. And so we need to see the verse being straightened up, properly translated, and put out through all of our English, different language, English language translations, through our French, Spanish, Chinese, Arabic, Pashtun, Farsi, Tagalog, Lingala, all kinds of languages, every language. So today we're going to just talk about a little bit more what happened in the Garden of Eden. And I'd also ask some of you, did you come up with some interesting quotations from other people with some crazy ideas? There are all kinds of variations on what goes on in Genesis 3:16. Did any of you come up with that? And then this is also our question and answer hour. So if you have any questions, we can talk about those as well. Make sure you are not muted when you bring up a question. I came across somebody the other day that said, have you read the book by so-and-so? And then they quoted a few things, and they had ideas on the Garden of Eden that I had never even heard before. Every week I come across new ideas where people said, well, I think this is what happened. Now, how is that possible? How can they wander all over the place? Well, it's possible because they aren't paying attention to what the passage is about. You know, they take a verse out of context, then you can say anything you want. And they do. Yeah.
I think the biggest challenge is you're born and raised in a church, right? or you get saved and you go into a church, and nobody teaches you how to learn. Nobody teaches you how to read the Bible. They teach you how to listen to what they have learned. That's what most sermons are. And while I can appreciate that on the one hand, I mean, sermons need to be, I really appreciate when we have a structure that teaches questioning, teaches critical thinking skills. And I think that's really more the underpinning problem, more than it is interpreting it wrongly. You can't interpret something right until you're taught, the chiasms and the pericopes and things like that, that I know that, hey, Luz.
So sorry, I just noticed your new note number. So a bit late, but I thought I'll pop in for a few minutes anyway.
Welcome aboard.
Hey.
But anyway, that's basically it. The whole idea that interpretations, bad interpretations are flying around, has underneath it, how can they fly around if people learn how to read the scriptures, learn the context, learn the culture? Like somebody said, anytime you read the Bible, it's really, you need to be looking over the shoulder of the people to whom it was originally being spoken, and try to understand it from their cultural point of view. For instance, I live in Texas, and the farmers fight the Longhorns. Does not mean what everybody else thinks in any other state. We're the Texas A&M Aggies. We're called the Fighting Farmers. And the Longhorns are the University of Texas. And if you read over my shoulder, you'll know what we're talking about. But if you don't, then you go, what are you doing out in the field chasing after a Longhorn? You'll get gored, because they'll take it either literally or, you know what I mean? So that's my point, is underpinnings of learning how to learning the cultural narrative. But by the time we've been taught so much of this, it's so ingrained in us, it's hard to undo. One of the things that I think all of us are noticing is when we got, well, I can speak for myself. When we got all this lovely good news, it was like people were in cement in terms of their scriptural understanding, because they've been so ingrained in it. It was just too hard to crack away from, which is why I think Mike Winger can get away with his wonderful presentations, because it's already in the paradigm of the people who are listening to him, and it's hard to understand how to critically think.
Okay, so let's critically think. I'm going to share something for a minute right now. I'm interacting with a pastor, an author, and he said to me, "I'd like to Zoom with you, but I don't have time, and I'm afraid we won't be able to go deep enough. So could you write me up something or send me something?" And I said, "Yeah, I will." So I've been working on this. Let me show you what it is. Letter 2, I took his name out, and it's on building bridges in 1 Timothy. Okay. So about 1 Timothy, let me make it a little bigger here. You can see it better on the screen. This is just a draft version here, but you get the idea. I noticed on this pastor's website, he talks about building bridges. So I thought, okay, I'll take that theme of building bridges and I'll use it because I think it works. So first, God built a bridge to Paul through Christ. Next, God built a bridge back to ministry for the wayward overseers through Christ. Okay. So let's talk about the first point. God built a bridge to Paul through Christ. Paul was the chief of sinners. That's what he says about himself in 1 Timothy 1:15. That's the King James Version wording. Yet he was not a first-degree sinner. He was the chief of sinners. That's bad news. But he wasn't a first-degree sinner. Like who? Well, the blasphemers, Hymenaeus and Alexander. Paul was a blasphemer. They were blasphemers. They received punishment fit for such sinners. They were abandoned to Satan to learn not to sin anymore. Paul was a second-degree blasphemer, and he merited a lighter treatment, according to 1 Timothy 1:13. And in mercy, God even appointed him to be an apostle, 1 Timothy 1:12. So all this my friend has to do is look at the first 15 verses or first 18, 20 verses of chapter 1. He'll get that idea. So Paul was the chief of sinners, but he wasn't a first-degree sinner meriting severe punishment. He was a second-degree sinner, and God showed him mercy, even to the point of appointing him to the ministry. So paragraph number 2. Why did Paul list these 3 sins about himself at the start of his letter to Timothy? I believe it was to glorify God and to set his example before Timothy as a model how to deal with the wayward overseers Paul had assigned to Timothy for restorative treatment. This was, after all, Timothy's assignment in Ephesus to, quote, command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer. That's verse 3, chapter 1. These themes of mercy to the second-degree offender and appointment to ministry through Christ somehow are not emphasized, or are they even present in the writings of commentators on 1 Timothy? So is it surprising that most preaching and common practice in churches do not take these truths into account when looking at what came next in 1 Timothy 2:8 to 3:13? So 1, God built a bridge to Paul through Christ. Next, God built a bridge back to ministry for the wayward overseers through Christ. This bridge to restorative treatment becomes more evident once we've recognized the bridge God built to Paul through Christ. We left those wayward overseers targeted by Paul and Timothy standing in need of a bridge to ministry back in the opening verses of the letter, in verses 3 and 4 of chapter 1. So who were they? Well, they weren't all the overseers in Ephesus, certainly, only the ones who had engaged in the errors described by Paul in these early verses. So who were they? Well, no need to claim that only male overseers had gone astray. The text is inclusive of men and women at this point, and it's inclusive later on as well. Pronouns are used that are not restricted to male or female, but could be both, and I think they are. So why did they need a bridge? Because they were like Paul, for whom Christ became the bridge to God and to ministry. How were they like Paul? They were like those who corresponded to his third sin listed in 1 Timothy 1:13. Paul had written about blasphemers who corresponded to his first sin in verses 1:18 to 20. So those were the blasphemers, Hymenaeus and Alexander. Paul had written about persecutors who corresponded to his second sin in verses 2:1 to 7. Why do we not see that he takes up those who corresponded to his third sin when we come to the 2 groups of people in 2:8 and likewise in 2:9 and following? So I have a major headline here. Where does Paul address the case of the wayward overseers in the body of the letter of 1 Timothy? Where does Paul address the case of the wayward overseers? Sadly, this question is not addressed in the discussions people are having about 1 Timothy 2 and 3. So they have wandered off into wayward side discussions not relevant to the passage. And so they are looking outside of the context and outside of the text, and they're fighting over 1 Timothy 2:12 and saying this is, or 13 and 14 about so-called order of creation and all this other stuff, because they haven't taken into account that Paul is talking about restoring the wayward overseers. All right, so I get into the weeds a little bit with him. In Ephesians, Paul used the prophetic rhetorical template identified elsewhere by Kenneth Bailey. Bailey also called that the jump, jump, high jump pattern. That's easier to remember. Jump, jump, high jump pattern. In 1 Timothy, Paul writes his instructive section on how to restore the wayward men and women among the overseers in a high jump section that runs from 2:8 to 3:13. Note the corresponding parts in the high jump section of the template, which is built as a chiasm. In parts A and A prime, now let's just look for a second down at the diagram here. We've got the jump, a small second bump, that's the jump. Then we have a large thing, that's the high jump. Let's go back. The jump is 1 Timothy 1:18 to 20, dealing with blasphemers. Then the next jump is 2:1 to 7, dealing with persecutors. The third one is 2:8 to 3:13, dealing with disruptors. The center point is Jesus, the faithful word, who restores overseers. And on the way up, we have wayward men and women. And on the way down, we have restored women and men. So we got men at each end, then women, and then men and women together. So I say that up here in the letter. In parts A and A prime, 2:8 and 3:12, he writes of the wayward men overseers. In parts B and B prime, he writes of the wayward women overseers. In the middle part, C, he gives the determinate factor, pistos halagos. What's that mean, pistos halagos? Pistos, faithful. Halagos,
Faithful is the word.
the word. And he writes of both men and women who aspired to return to oversight and service. Says, if anyone aspires to oversight, he or she desires a good work. And then later on, he even talks about deacons. So we've got 10 verses here in the middle, male and female, elders and deacons. Jesus would serve as the bridge back to ministry for these former overseers. I think in 3:1a, we're talking about the Logos, not just a saying, but Jesus himself. The wayward men overseers of 2:8 and the wayward women overseers of 2:9 to 15 are the antecedent for the pronoun anyone in 3:1b. So, how did Paul advise Timothy in detail to help them cross the bridge back to ministry thanks to Jesus? He advised, now this is the whole thing. People don't ask, and so they don't find the answers. He advised Timothy that the men were to cease their false teaching in church, 2:8. And I got some footnotes here that help people get more details. I refer them to my book, Back to Eden. He likewise advised Timothy that the women were to be allowed to learn as good rabbinical students learned, in silence and subjection. So that's 2:11. Like the men, they too were to cease their false teaching and practice, which is described in 2:12. What if Timothy didn't understand why these wayward overseers deserve to be retrained? Well, to learn in this way meant to take that learning and then to teach it to others. This was why these persons could aspire to oversight. Jesus would help them. Jesus would help them cross that bridge back to service. They could be restored because God was merciful to Paul. And Paul adds, because God was merciful to Eve. To Eve? Because people have been misunderstanding what went on in the Garden of Eden. They have totally missed what Paul was saying in verses 13 and 14 of 1 Timothy 2.
Yeah.
God had made a distinction between his words to Adam, the purposeful and first-degree eater. Adam, the purposeful and first-degree eater, and to Eve, the well-intentioned but waylaid second-degree eater. The serpent enemy and the man had rebelled against God on purpose, and each received a curse pronounced because of their rebellion. The woman received no curse on her or because of her, because she was not a purposeful rebel, and she received the merciful appointment of having the offspring who would crush the enemy's head. So where does the letter go from here? Simply to point out that Paul says Adam was created first and then Eve, and Adam wasn't the seed, but she was. He brings that up to point to the fact that wayward offenders who are second degree can now be appointed into the ministry, or in the case of the wayward teachers at Ephesus, put back into the ministry. Well, so much for that letter. Responses?
Excellent.
So it's a different hook. It's a different way of explaining this. I'm saying, look, yeah, I can lay this thing out, and I did in the book Back to Eden, but I didn't say, I don't think I focused enough on, this is what Paul was saying to Timothy. You stay there to correct these people. So then nobody looks for those directions in the rest of the letter, and they can wander all over the place. No, look in 2:8 to what, almost all of chapter 2 and all of chapter 3. He talks about it in detail. There it is. And if you don't realize that's about correcting these people, then you do anything you want to with those verses, and they do. And when you get off topic in interpreting the Bible, bad things can happen. I'm going to stop the recording at this point. We're going to maybe talk about some private things afterwards, just for our group. So we're gonna end right now. So I encourage people, coming up this Monday and every Monday, the first Monday of every month, we try to offer the Eden workshop on Genesis 2-3. So simply go to Tru316.com/workshop, sign up and become a part of that. And we'll rejoice to see you there.